Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Khaldoun Azhari. I'm the president of this club. I have the honor to host today our guest speaker, Senator Peter Whish-Wilson. He is the Senate of Australian Greens, and he will talk today about the impact of whaling, coal, and climate change on our oceans, and the great, especially the Great Barrier Reef in Australia that is under attack by various sources, according to environmentalists. And time has come to take serious action to save it and to save other aspects of our planet. Senator Wilson will talk about such issues in Australia and in that area, and he will answer questions after his presentation. Senator Wilson is an economist by training, and created and taught one of Australia's first ever environmental finance courses at the University of Tasmania. That's a beautiful island south of Australia. And he uses the knowledge and experience to lead the fight in the Senate against inequality, pollution, excessive corporate power, tax avoidance, and other issues. And he is currently chairing the Australian Senate inquiry into the correct and future impact of climate change on marine fisheries and biodiversity, which has largely focused on recent damage. Sorry, there is reflection in the paper. Serious damage done to the Great Barrier Reef. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest speaker today. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for being here to listen to me today. While this is my first trip to Japan, I have always wanted to visit Japan. My father was an executive in the iron ore business and had many good Japanese friends and business associates over many years. One of my strongest childhood memories was of the frequent visits to our home in the 1970s by Japanese businessmen who always used to bring astonishing gifts to my family. Apparently they loved my mother's cooking, but my father often came to Japan on business trips, and the first foreigners I met were Japanese through Japanese business. In fact, my father, if I can show you, do you know how to drive this? No? Click for the next. Created quite a stir in his first trip to Japan by wearing a purple suit, where he said he stopped the traffic when he crossed the road. So that's a photo of my father from 1974, and I tried to recreate that photo yesterday, but I didn't have a purple suit. But anyway, I'm here to talk about two important environmental issues. One that unites my country in Australia, which is opposition to commercial whaling, and another, which is tackling climate change, which is an issue that divides my country. It's interesting that in Australia, we see ourselves as being a global leader in the whaling debate. And on the other issue, Japan, following Kyoto, is respected internationally as a very strong leader in the climate debate. And there's two contrasts there. And I'll say up front that I came to Japan to meet other parliamentarians and other stakeholders, and I came to listen and to learn, not to preach or point the finger at anybody. And I will say Australia is in no position to take the moral high ground on environmental issues. As someone who spends much of his time holding his own government to account as a Greens senator, I know this better than most people. I'm here instead to plead the case for a reasoned discussion on whale conservation and prove that we can disagree without being disagreeable. I probably don't fit many of the caricatures that the Japanese media or people may have on the misty-eyed, rabid, radical environmentalists who have come to stereotype anti-whaling campaigners. I'm an ex-soldier, an ex-international banker, an ex-business owner, as well as being a lover of our oceans. I'm a very passionate surfer, a diver and a fisherman. So in this respect, this final respect, I'm a pretty typical Australian. And my views on the opposition to whaling are also very typical of most Australians. Given international opposition to Japanese whaling, Australians genuinely don't understand what drives Japan's determination to continue this practice. It seems to fly in the face of so much we like about Japan, and it has been put to me that in many respects it's out of character for the Japanese that the Australian people know. The continued insistence on Southern Ocean whaling is probably the single biggest barrier to Japan having closer ties to Australia. We understand why Japan hunted whales post-World War II in the Southern Ocean for protein at a time of scarcity. My country did too. We only banned whaling in the 1980s. So we were also whaling for centuries. It's part of Australian culture, whaling. But we've turned our back on this culture, as have many other countries. But my journey here today, coming to Japan to meet other parliamentarians, started when I respectfully approached Shinzo Abe and spoke to him at a conference, an official function in Canberra. Like Taro Yamamoto, who I met today, I also got in a bit of trouble for breaking some diplomatic protocols. But I did approach the Prime Minister and we had a respectful discussion, and I handed him a letter from Paul Watson, who was the head of Sea Shepherd. I have had good meetings in Japan yesterday and today, and we had more planned for next week with parliamentarians, but given the election being called tomorrow, we're not sure how many more meetings I will have. But I am the first Australian politician to come to Japan to take my hat off and make a low bow and talk about this issue of whaling with politicians who support whaling and those who don't. But I think it's very important that I come here to listen and to better understand. Now, Japanese officials and some Japanese people would be aware of the long-running official opposition to whaling from consecutive Australian governments now. However, I'm not sure the Japanese people are aware of the depth and the breadth that Australians feel on this issue. Recent polls in Australia show that 92% of Australians are opposed to Japanese whaling, and nearly 75% want the Australian government to send our own vessels to the Southern Ocean and patrol and monitor Japanese whaling activities. These opinions are held by supporters from all political parties in Australia. The Australian government's position on opposing whaling is not due to pressure from a small number of advocates. There's no doubt that Australians love whales, and this is a deeply held feeling. Our governments have taken steps to protect whales and dolphins under Australian law and have created an Australian whale sanctuary. Now, whale watching is big business in Australia. It's an industry worth several hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And the recovery of humpback whale numbers, for example, there's been a big increase in whale tourism. And this is established in rural communities more than it is in urban communities, including in locations that once supported whaling stations like my hometown in Bishono in Tasmania. Now, I understand that ecotourism around whale watching is building in Japan. It is still small scale, but building. And this advancement of a still small industry has significant room for progress. Australia and Japan have long been friends, and we can help with capacity building around tourism and sharing experiences with whale conservation. And today I'd like to invite Japanese parliamentarians, and I have in my discussions, to visit Australia or Samoa or Tonga on whale watching tours. And I would be very happy to accompany them myself. It's a life-changing experience seeing a whale up close, I can guarantee it. and they would perhaps see for themselves that whale conservation can be pro-economy, pro-jobs and pro-Japan. I wanted to show the video now if we can get it to work. Sorry, that's a very gratuitous photo of me surfing, just to show you. In fact, Tara Yamamoto this morning also told me he's a good surfer, so I've invited him to come to Australia. So this one here, please. Yeah. Now this video is only very short. That's okay. I don't think. Oh no, I think that's the wrong video. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the wrong video. Sorry, we may have to turn that one off. Never mind. I had a video of which we can try and find for you. So maybe of a southern right whale in Tasmania. Down the bottom. I don't think it's going to work though. No, it's not. It's not working. So we'll go back. Could I perhaps ask if we could go back to the? How do I go back to the other slide? Thank you. We'll play that one in a minute. Yeah. So I can provide that whale video, but that's a southern right whale which were nearly hunted to extinction. That had a very close encounter with a friend of mine who was off the back of a boat, and the whale came right up. A fully grown southern right whale came right up to the boat, and he actually put his hand on its nose, and the whale did this little dance, and then they spent an hour in the water, and the whale came back 3 times. These kind of encounters are life-changing experiences for people when they get to meet these beautiful creatures. So some whale populations have recovered. The Australian government officially, as have international authorities, have officially recognised that the recovery, much of that recovery has to do with the banning of whaling in many countries around the world. But some, like humpbacks, have recovered, but others, like southern right whales, are still very much under pressure. Now, Japan's insistence on pursuing whaling has impacted on the country's reputation, but I know you already know that. But what I wanted to talk about today was this reputational damage may have unintended consequences for our region. Now, whether we like it or not, Australia is getting dragged into the politics of the South China Sea. We may play a role in any future conflict in your region. And this is largely because we are good friends and allies of Japan, and we have an existing an alliance with the US. And it's worth reflecting that what underlies the geopolitical debate on this issue is respect for a global rules-based order, for the law of the sea, for rights of navigation. Now, while we want to put our arms around a friend, as Japan, I generally raise this issue today as a concerned friend of Japan. It still seems incongruous to most Australians that Japan has, for all intents and purposes, thumbed its nose at the International Court of Justice and their 2014 ruling against Japanese whaling, and it has openly questioned the ICJ, the International Court of Justice's jurisdiction and competence on marine matters. This has also concerned many experts in the field of international law. Well, what is the bigger context of this? A recent article in the Washington Post called "The Fishing Wars Are Coming" speculated that escalating conflict over fishing and marine resources could soon lead to what they called a global fish war. It goes on to outline how China is deploying both hard and soft power to acquire natural marine resources, that it is directly enabling and militarising the worldwide robbing of ocean resources, and this is nothing short of what they call hybrid warfare. He goes on to suggest that illegal fishing be included in new and existing mandates for policing of the world's oceans. New treaties to tighten up international law should include for the high seas, and they want a much bigger role for the US Navy and Coast Guard and other friendly nations. Well, what role will Japan play in this challenging future conflict over marine resources if it is also seen, in the eyes of the international community, not to respect international rulings on maritime resources and jurisdictions? Given the importance of the ocean as a source of food for Japan, it would be well suited to play a leadership role in this most important of issues, rather than potentially be seen as an escalator of this conflict or even a culprit. I note with honesty that alarm bells have been raised in Australia, including in the Senate, over recent pro-whaling Japanese legislation that could be perceived as militarising the Antarctic, the waters in the Antarctic or the Antarctic Treaty, such as the potential for Coast Guard or military vessels to accompany the whaling fleet, military surveillance technologies, new powers to board, seize and jail vessels in the Southern Ocean. And I would ask the honest question, would Japan be concerned, for example, if China was to use its military to supervise their fishing fleets on the high seas in the name of security, in the way that Japan is doing for its Southern Ocean fleets? Now, recently, the Australian Senate passed a motion calling on the Australian government to meet its election commitment to send an Australian customs vessel to the Southern Ocean this summer. So the Liberal government in Australia has a long-standing election commitment that they will send a customs vessel to monitor Japanese whaling. They went to the 2013 and 16 elections with this commitment, but to date they have not fulfilled that election commitment. Interestingly, the Senate, which surprised me, the Australian Senate also supported a motion recognising the work of Sea Shepherd in saving the lives of thousands of whales over the last 13 years. Now, while we have no Sea Shepherd in the Antarctic waters this summer, which no doubt many Japanese officials will be happy with, we may potentially have an Australian vessel and Japanese vessels, the best of friends, facing off over whaling activities in the Southern Ocean. This should be avoided, and it can be avoided. So I want to highlight at this juncture that while I'm a strong opponent of Southern Ocean whaling, I don't do this for any underlying anti-Japanese reason, and nor does anyone else that I know in Australia. But I do believe that whaling is the sole remaining barrier for enduring closer Australia-Japanese ties. A couple of other quick points on whaling. Australia is proud of its track record of pursuing this issue through the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and will no doubt continue to challenge the legality of commercial whaling. Australia and other anti-whaling nations will still have legal avenues to pursue to prevent continuing whaling in the Southern Ocean. In 2015, Australian environment groups assembled a panel of international law experts to examine Japan's new whaling program, and they found that this program was in breach of international law and identified several legal options for Australia to consider. This includes pursuing Japan via its non-compliance with the UN Convention Law of the Sea. Australia is also proud that it is a leader in non-lethal scientific whale research. We have proven time and again that there is no need to study whales by killing them. We have managed to find ways to track the movements of whales, estimate population size, growth rates, breeding success and interactions with other fisheries. We have learned to do these things without the need to harvest whales. And I'm proud to say in my home state of Tasmania, many of the world's best scientists actually live, and they do this kind of work. As I said, another area of very promising research has been around the importance of whales to the health of our oceans. We've only recently discovered that whales essentially fertilise the ocean, and that especially iron fertilisation, through their byproducts, through their, you don't mind me saying it to you guys, through their poo, is absolutely critical to the growth of krill in the Southern Ocean. And krill is the basis of our food chain. So as whales go down there, every year they migrate to the Southern Ocean. They have done for millions of years because of the krill. They eat the krill, they get strong, they then fertilise the oceans, and that fertiliser is essential to the growth of the krill. So while whale numbers were very low, so was krill productivity. With larger whale numbers, we get healthy oceans. We get more fish and more fishing. So whales are a very important link in the health of our oceans. And they have been for millions of years. That's why they go to the Southern Ocean. And there's been some great research done on that. And I even believe that in the International Whaling Commission, Chile sponsored a motion outlining the importance of this new scientific work. So I'd like to now move to another issue that I don't believe my country has done anywhere near enough on, and that is tackling global warming. And may I say that Australia is very vulnerable to climate change, as vulnerable as any nation is to this issue. And I would also like to recognise the importance of climate and tackling global warming to many of the third world countries. We're also, sadly, we've dropped our leadership, not just on the climate debate, but also in creating marine sanctuaries to protect our marine resources in Australia. And our record on protecting biodiversity in Australia is also, sadly, very poor. So I want to make it clear again, we're in no position to be pointing the finger. I wanted to show you a video on the Great Barrier Reef and why this issue should be important to Japan. It's ironic that Japan is the biggest importer of Australian coal. It's also one of the biggest importers of tourism services to the Great Barrier Reef. The Japanese people love the Great Barrier Reef and Queensland. Until China recently passed them in tourism numbers, they've been a very big and important stakeholder in the reef. But as I'm about to show you, the Great Barrier Reef, the biggest living organism on the planet that you can see from space, it's a natural wonder of the world, is dying. It's very sick, and if we keep seeing warmings of our global oceans, the last 2 years we've seen unprecedented ocean temperatures, and the reef is dying because the coral is cooking. It ejects the algae that live in the coral because it becomes toxic at certain temperatures, and then without the algae, the coral slowly dies. And we've now seen 2 unprecedented bleaching events, and I'll just show you a little video and see if this one works. Yeah. So this is me. I did this for Facebook, so you'll have to forgive the propaganda for my political party. But
sadly, politics and politicians.
Okay, Brie, I have my Swiss Army arms.
if you don't believe in global warming, I challenge you to come out here and stick your head under the water.
The reef, it's incredible. Parts are still beautiful. Nearly half of it has literally cooked from warming oceans. It's critically endangered on many levels. Too many politicians are not acting on climate change because it's too easy to turn a blind eye. So here's a challenge to all my fellow members of Parliament. Come up to the Great Barrier Reef and see for yourself.
I dived on this reef 5 years ago with my kids and didn't see any reef mortality or bleaching. 2 of the sites we visited today, we've seen more than 2/3 of the coral die from mass coral bleachings. And this is just in the last couple of years.
This reef, our ocean, is not ours to trash, only ours to protect. Stopping new fossil fuel mines is the single biggest thing Australia can do right now to make a difference. We are the custodians of this reef. We need to show leadership on the climate debate. Ask your local MP to visit the reef. Tell them to take all possible action to cut emissions and stop the Adani.
Uy, huele feísimo. Pero vamos a poner yodo y todo. Uf, cuidado. Okay. Huele. Que no tiene ningún anzuelo ni nada, ¿verdad?
Picking up a bit of extra static there. But,
can I have that? Yeah, thank you.
The important, if I could perhaps go to the next slide. Okay. So this is how big the Great Barrier Reef is. It stretches from the top of Australia all the way down Queensland. The northern section of the reef you can see in 2016. The ocean temperatures, it was an El Nino year, so it was very warm. The ocean temperatures there were so severe that we lost more than 2/3 of the reef in that northern section of the Barrier Reef died. as in that's full reef mortality. Now, the scientists, the climate scientists that study these things couldn't have predicted that the following year we would have an unprecedented back-to-back bleaching event. Their models, their climate models showed this wasn't possible till 2043. But we had a back-to-back bleaching event that, unfortunately, if you look at the 2017 slide, killed the middle section of the Barrier Reef, which is right where all the tourism markets are, like Cairns and Port Douglas and Townsville. Now, the southern section of the Barrier Reef would have been bleached as well, but oddly enough, a cyclone or a hurricane or a typhoon, as you may call it, saved the reef by bringing rain and cooled the water down. Unfortunately, that same cyclone did severe damage to the bottom part of the Great Barrier Reef. So we are now assessing the damage, but I'm chairing the committee, the Federal Senate Environment Committee that's been up and taking evidence on this issue. The preliminary surveys show that for the top of the reef and the middle section of the reef, we've got nearly 48% mortality. So nearly 48% of the Barrier Reef has died from these two bleaching events. This is also on top of other pressures on the reef from runoff from agriculture, from invasive species like starfish, and other pressures to do with overfishing and the use of this area as a coal highway for coal ships. Now, the importance of the Barrier Reef is not just its biodiversity and it's important to fisheries and the fishing industry. It's also the biggest employer in Queensland. It employs nearly 60,000 people in Queensland. So it's a very, very significant part of the economy. Now, my message today is the reef is still beautiful, but it's endangered. We have a term that's emerging in Australia called last chance tourism, and it's a term that's being applied to the Great Barrier Reef. We still want the Japanese people to come, as they always have, to dive on the reef. It's still beautiful. You should still come, but please come and understand that the reef is very sick. Unfortunately, the water temperature now, going out of winter in Australia, is still way above the long-term average. Now, we've seen the water in the Caribbean and off Florida is also got unprecedented in terms of its warmth. That's why we've had these super hurricanes in the US. So climate change, the impacts of climate change, in Australia, even the Green Movement used to say, this is what a future under climate change would look like. This is what to expect in the future under climate change. Now, we are saying it's here. Its impacts are already being felt. So we are campaigning very hard on leaving all new coal in the ground, because we know that coal and emissions, global emissions, are closely correlated. And we are campaigning to stop some of these big new coal mines from going ahead, and also to our government to take much more action and roll out to being very heavily reliant on renewable energy. My state in Tasmania is nearly 90% renewable energy, but we believe Australia by 2050 could be 100% renewable. We have amazing resources for renewable energy, for baseload power, as well as disruptive technology such as battery technology and rooftop solar. We believe will be a game changer. Now, I understand every country is different, and Japan has a different energy mix and different demands, but obviously I would join with the Global Green Movement in urging Japan to please do whatever it can. Everything counts in the climate debate, and given the lack of leadership we're seeing in the US with Donald Trump, it's very important that Japan, as one of the 6 big nations on climate change, shows leadership on this issue. It would mean a lot to me and to many Australians and to the Great Barrier Reef if Japan could show that leadership. And I urge you to do everything you possibly can today, because this Barrier Reef, Australia is a custodian of the reef, but it's everyone's reef. It's a global natural wonder that you own and that I own. My last point is it is listed for World Heritage as a natural wonder, but it came very close to being listed this year in the World Heritage in Danger list. The tourism industry lobbied very hard to stop that. The Australian government is embarrassed by what's happened on the Great Barrier Reef. They don't want you to know about the extent of bleaching on the reef. They'll be embarrassed to know that I'm here talking about this, and no doubt I'm going to cop some flack when I get home over this issue. They want to turn a blind eye to this. But if the World Heritage Committee decides in 2019 to put the Great Barrier Reef on the in danger list, then it's been put to me as chair of the Environment Committee, the Senate Environment Committee in Australia, that they'll need to put all the world's coral reefs on the in danger list. 100 of the 104 coral reefs around the world are in third world countries, and nearly 500 million people rely on coral reefs for their livelihood. So this is a global issue, and it's a global emergency. And I'm here today to say, please be aware of what's happening in the Great Barrier Reef. I know Japan cares deeply about it. It's very closely connected to the reef, but you are in a position to make a difference. Could I also say, before I finish, as a Tasmanian, the warming waters we've seen in Australia have not just impacted the Great Barrier Reef. In my state of Tasmania, we've had an ecosystem there that's 10,000 years old of giant kelp forests. Now, these kelp forests are nearly 70 to 80 metres tall. They go from the bottom of the ocean all the way to the top. They're magnificent. We have divers come from all around the world to see them. Last summer, the last kelp forest disappeared. Gone. Every single one gone. And they are the nurseries and sanctuaries for marine life, for rock lobsters, for abalone, for commercial fisheries, as well as the biodiversity on the coast of Tasmania. So we're very sad that we've lost an ecosystem. It's from warming waters, it's also from invasive species, and it's from the damage done from storms. Exactly what's happened on the Great Barrier Reef. In fact, those starfish that are eating the giant kelp forest have moved down with warming waters to Tasmania. And scientists are saying in Tasmania that hundreds of species of marine life that live off the coast will have nowhere to go. They can't shift like other marine species can from warming waters. And within 100 years, by the end of the century, we are likely to lose them all. So this is where I live, in my estate. We've had problems with aquaculture, with salmon from warming waters. We've had outbreaks of disease in our oyster industries, called Pacific Oyster Mortality Syndrome. And the abalone industry and the rock lobster industry are in trouble. So this is not just about green issues and environmentalists, this is also about jobs and industries. So climate change has very serious ramifications for the economy in my country, as it does in other countries. So Japan is a very important friend of Australia's and will continue to be so. I ask you to perhaps to listen and take on board what I've said today. And I hope that in my trip here I can make some contacts and continue some dialogue with Japanese parliamentarians, presuming that they are re-elected after your election in a month's time. And I've invited all Japanese politicians to come to Australia, to come diving with me on the Barrier Reef, and of course to come whale watching as well and see that whales can be economy and they can be jobs too. So thank you for listening to me here today.
Thank you very much. By the way, we have elections for House of Representatives, but the House of Councillors, they are staying around, so
okay.
You can invite them. I would like to open the floor to your questions, and we will receive in your seat, please. The mic is beside you. Who would like to take the first question, please? State your name and affiliation, please, first.
Daniel Hurst, freelance journalist. I wanted to ask, you mentioned Sea Shepherd is for the first time in many years this year not going to go to the Southern Ocean. What's your view on the tactics that Sea Shepherd used over these campaigns? Did that help or hinder the case you're making here about winning over arguments, or did it sort of flare up opinion in Japan? I just wanted you to reflect on whether that beyond the immediate goal of disrupting the whaling, whether that had a negative impact at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for your question. Someone put to me, maybe rather cynically or not, that if Sea Shepherd didn't exist, perhaps the Fisheries Agency might have invented Sea Shepherd, because it's been useful to paint anti-whaling campaigners as being radical environmentalists. It's a two-edged sword, no doubt about it. The Senate formally recognised Sea Shepherd saving the lives of thousands of whales, and I believe that is true. But I also understand that it's potentially antagonised stakeholders in Japan, and I can understand why the Japanese people wouldn't want foreigners telling them what to do. I totally understand that. So I support direct action and the tactics necessary to save whales' lives. I've been on record as saying that, but I recognise now that that's not going to happen anymore, and that perhaps the only way that we can stop whale hunting in the Southern Ocean, I think the only way is for Japan to come to that decision themselves. And I think now it's important for people like me to come and meet with the Japanese, especially the decision makers, and develop a dialogue, and for me to listen and better understand Japan's reasons for whaling. Could also say Sea Shepherd has changed, in many ways has changed its operations recently. They're spending most of their resources now on combating illegal fishing. Most of their boats are tied up in West Africa, working with West African nations on illegal fishing. And recently in Timor-Leste, they apprehended 12 Chinese fishing vessels that were fishing illegally. And I understand those vessels have now been arrested and interdicted by the authorities. So they're spending a lot of their time now working on illegal fishing, which I think is welcomed by the Australian government. They put out of action what we call the Bandit Six, who were the 6 Patagonian toothfish poachers, all illegal fishing. I understand organised crime was funding these boats, and they managed to directly put them out of business. So they are changing in the way they're operating, but yes, I think I can understand that the Japanese people perhaps have seen them as being not constructive in their approach.
Yes. Next question. Yes, please.
Siegfried Gill, a freelancer from Germany. If I see the pictures here from 2016 and 17, I think what I understood is, right, it means it is not in good not really in bad condition, the corals.
Yep.
And then green is in a better condition.
Yep.
But if I look on a picture from 2017,
Yep.
there are some areas in better condition. So is it possible for corals to recover?
Right.
But why is it died in 2016 and in 2017 more green?
So it's a good question. The maps only show the bleaching since the last survey.
Yeah.
So if you were to overlay 2016 with the 2017 and add them together, the picture would be very different. So they're the reefs that were surveyed in 16, but in 17 they had additional bleaching in those areas, but no bleaching, no new bleaching in those northern areas. So that's the only new bleaching was in those in the middle areas there. So what you'll get from the Australian government, maybe within a month, is an updated map showing all the bleaching, the total mortality, and that's due, I think, for release soon. But the southern area, because of the cyclone, only suffered very small bleaching, about 3%, I understand. But no one's done any surveys on the damage, the physical damage from the cyclone. But I understand it's been very severe. In fact, in the areas where you visit the islands off Townsville, Daydream Island, etc., people still swim and go to the beaches because they're beautiful places, but there's very little snorkelling on the reefs occurring now. They've been very badly damaged by the storms. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, more questions? All right, let me ask until you find. You declared global emergency about the reefs and other issues. Could you tell us which country is the most responsible for that, and how could some organization like United Nations or Greens, or which is the most powerful tool to deal with this emergency?
So the Australian government is spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to help the reef, trying to help repair the reef, but they're considered to be band-aid solutions at the moment. A lot of it's targeted at agricultural runoff, at catching starfish. You literally go out and you drill into them and put bleach into the starfish that kills them. There's a number of programs. There's even discussion about pumping cold water up from parts of the reef to keep, like literally using propellers, just at very acute spots where the tourists go, because of course you couldn't do this. There's been just all sorts of talk about how to try and protect the reef, but I would say it's fair to say that there really is very little we can do about the bleaching, the extent of the bleaching, the mass bleaching events that we've seen on the Barrier Reef. The only thing we can do is to cut global emissions. And I say that even if everybody acted today, if we had a perfect scenario and everyone cut emissions to zero, we still have 16 years of warming based on what's in the atmosphere now. So even on the most optimistic scenarios, we're very likely to see more bleaching events in the next decade. And the reef, it takes about 15 years for corals to recover, if they recover, if they do. Many of them will die. And what most people don't understand about the Barrier Reef is the corals that, if you go back to my picture, I don't know how I go back. No, I've lost it, sorry. The fast-growing corals, the stag corals and the plate corals, are the most colourful, and they're also got very unusual shapes. Okay, so you see the horns coming out? I mean, they would normally be blue. But when you go diving, it's like a movie, like Avatar. The colours on the reef are amazing, absolutely amazing. There are all sorts of different beautiful colours, and those corals are really important because they provide a shelter and a home for fish and marine creatures from predators. And if you take away the structure of the reef, its unusual shape, then what you're doing is you're totally changing the ecosystem, because those fish will have nowhere to hide. And that's why they're so successful at living there and surviving there, because the reef provides protection from predators. So when you change the order of the hierarchy, then you'll lose that biodiversity. And the Barrier Reef protects the mangroves on the coast of Queensland, because the reef stops the swells coming in. Mangroves only occur in areas where there's no energy or very low energy. The mangroves regulate the rainfall and the weather above the rainforests. So the reef actually regulates the weather and the rain in the rainforest. So it is absolutely essential. It's been priced at about $6.4 billion a year to the Australian economy from tourism and ecosystem services such as fisheries. The value, the tangible economic value is about $60 billion to Australia, but the reef is priceless. You can't put a price on it. It's so important to the environment that you could pick a number. So, you know, I can say to you now with confidence that the reef will never be the same again as the reef that I grew up with as a child. It will never be the same again, but it's still hanging on. It's still surviving. It's still worth seeing. It's still beautiful. But you may remember from the video footage I showed you there, it was all dead, but there was a little bit of blue See a little bit of blue on some of the corals where the reef is trying to hold on to life. So we desperately hope that we don't get another bleaching event this year. I don't think anybody thought it was possible we could have 3 years in a row of ocean bleaching. But it's very bad in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, even your reefs off Japan. I understand from meeting with one of your environment minister yesterday is also suffering from bleaching and warming. And he's noticed a change in fisheries here. The fish are, we're getting different fish species with the changes in fish, in ocean currents and ocean temperatures. So the ocean's changing, and we've caused that. The question is, can we stop it? Is there still hope? And I believe there is. But we must act. Otherwise, it will undermine all of us, our economies, and it won't. The ocean we know today won't be there for our children and our children's children.
Seems like doomsday scenario.
Well, it could be if we don't act. Yeah.
All right. Yes? Okay. Siegfried?
Could you tell us something about the Green Party in Australia? You're a member of the Green Party.
I am.
So what kind of role does a party play in the role of the Australian policy?
Okay. So I know in Germany you have a Green Party as well. The world's first Green Party started in Tasmania, where I'm from. That was nearly 40 years ago. And we're about 10% of the vote in Australia, across all states. And we share the balance of power in the Australian Parliament. So we have a big influence on policy and on the parliamentary agenda. And we have 4 pillars: peace and non-violence. We have social justice, and of course protecting the economy. And they're the key factors in our policies and tackling inequality. So very similar to the German Greens, but in Australia we still have, especially in Tasmania, big tracts of native rainforest and untouched wild forests, very diverse species forests, and we spend a lot of time working on animal rights issues as well, and yeah, very broad agenda. I must say, reading about Japanese politics, we have some similar agendas to political parties here, including the Communist Party here in Japan. We share many similar views.
Did you meet anybody in Japan of the Green Party? I think there's a Green Party here.
I'm meeting them this afternoon, yeah. And I said I hope to have more meetings depending on how things are going with the election. But this is an important time to make some contacts and develop some relationships. But yeah, I hope many Japanese parliamentarians do visit Canberra. I've met them when they've been in Canberra. Perhaps next time I can take them whale watching when they come.
Thank you. More questions do you have? Okay. All right. I think this wraps up our event today. I think we extended some time. Sorry about being late a little bit, but thank you very much for coming and enlightening us about the emergency going on in Australia and other parts of the world. And I'm sure your message is being heard, and I hope we see you again sometime in the future, telling us some good news this time.
Yes, for some good news, sir.
Thank you very much for coming.
Okay, thank you. Arigatou gozaimasu.